Hello and welcome to this video on making something less like a bonsai and more like a living diorama, a hobbit hole. There is a style of bonsai called penjing or saekai. Where this differs is that it is mainly intended as a display piece and bonsai is a secondary concern. Think of it as very much like a diorama or landscape. To do this, we've chosen an azalea. The choice is driven by two factors. The first is branch and foliage structure, the second is the root structure. As for foliage and branches, we wanted a species that would have both a relatively thick trunk and dense but fine branches. This will lead to a complete canopy of scaled foliage. This will have the effect of later producing flowers, as all azaleas do, but they're not the main focus. The second are the roots. We needed to choose a species that will work with a somewhat smaller area for roots to grow. In this case, an azalea will work for that purpose. If we were going to plant the tree differently or not use a complete hobbit hole from front to back, we could have chosen a different species such as oak. You'll see as we assemble this example, the hobbit hole goes right the way through. This means there is a large area where roots cannot grow, and this is why we chose an azalea in this case. With the species chosen, we also have the parts. That is the set dressing. The walls, windows, doors, and later fence. Further, there's a pot, but the choice of pot or similar is less important. We are going to use a stone slab in this instance, and we've used it previously for another planting, but we had to repot that. The last matter we need to consider is the substrate or soil and the muck that we'll be using. We need both a somewhat more organic matter-rich soil, and it needs to be less well draining for this scenario. Muck will be used to keep the back and sides together and prevent the soil from eroding away. To start, we will secure the hobbit hole to the rock with a small amount of silicone adhesive. This will prevent the water used from flowing under the hobbit hole and causing problems while also holding it in place. We will also secure some wire now with silicone, but you could use hot glue, or depending on the kind of pot you're using, you may not need to do it at all. And now we'll add a small wing of muck around the back and sides of the setting. This wing on each side and the back section will provide the support and prevent the soil from flowing away whenever we water it, and especially until the soil becomes established and the tree roots grow right the way through. And more of this soil is placed to one side so it can support the bonsai azalea better. Given the size and shape of the hobbit hole, we opted to add a small layer of gravel at the bottom of this planting to improve drainage, particularly as azaleas don't like being particularly wet. To this, we've added a layer of soil. This is just a generic, good quality potting soil, but not a special bonsai mix. We did add some more material in the form of fine pine bark, and this is to increase the soil acidity slightly. We could have done this chemically as well, but the pine bark is a little more convenient. Instead of doing that, we could have instead used an azalea mix, but that's unnecessary if we adjust a cheaper bulk standard mix with small additional amendments when required. It saves a small amount of money for each individual tree, but it does add up very quickly. We add this up to the level of the hobbit house, and then a little higher again. This will begin to create the base of the hobbit hole mound. And now for the azalea. This is planted into and on top of the mound on the side. The reason we planted it partly on top of the mound and partly into it is that we'll continue to add more soil in the near future. Once we have the soil over the root mass initially, we can secure the plant in place with wire. We'll tighten it down but not too tightly, otherwise we start to cut off and break roots. On top of this, we will now add more soil again and water it in. We may need to repeat this step several times in order to get the right height. It should now begin to resemble a bare mound that is just a pile of dirt with some small features on it. The bulk of these features are the hobbit hole itself and a small plant. There's nothing other than a bare bones scenario, and it's not very impressive yet. Wiring will start to make things look better. Between wiring and pruning, we can make this look more realistic and natural appearing. The basics will be to remove the directly vertical growth, that is, branches growing up and down. We also want to remove every other directly opposing branch, and pruning branches back to pairs for ramification. Finally, the unwanted growth on the mound side itself. As you'll see with the trunk, the way it sits, those branches won't work. You need to remove them to have the trunk sit hard against the hill. almost as though it's blown slightly backwards and resting against it. The branches are then wired to force them slightly downwards, as though it has aged somewhat. With the size of this azalea, it's not as easy to get that appearance yet, but given that the hobbit house acts as a quasi-growth plate, it'll force the nabari to widen because the roots have to grow wide to get more soil to grow into. This is another reason why we chose the full-depth hobbit house. Moss is now needed to make this look like it is covered in grass. A micrograss might also work if this were a larger example, but at this side, moss is arguably the best option. We've also used a lighter green moss in this case, which has been a pain to grow, to be honest, but it is the best option for this azalea species. Between the flowers, leaves and everything else, it needs a lighter green colour. A larger tree or different species might be better suited to a darker moss that we have been able to grow more easily, so this is an example where something like oak would work well. We now water this in again, so this has already become quite wet, but between the moss and the drainage it will dry out reasonably quickly. The fence is the final thing we needed to add. While you don't have to add it, doing so will make this look more lived in and real. How you make this is your choice. We used small popsicle sticks cut to length and fixed with wire. There are some finishing touches you can add, although these aren't strictly necessary. The last touches we need to add for ours are some stones for the path, some accent plants in the form of ferns, and cleaning any dirt and mess from assembling the scene. In summary, the process is relatively straightforward, as long as you tackle each step in order and have the parts you need to hand. If you were to try and do this and jump steps and try to come back and fix them, it is much harder, whereas building it up gradually is much easier to do, and it means you can handle any problems that occur at that time and save yourself a lot of trouble down the track. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions or suggestions you have below.